Hello, I'm David Kerr, Director of Communications with the Diocese of Lansing, and as some of you may know, the Diocese this month published a new policy on gender identity, which is aimed at fostering the highest standards of pastoral care for those with gender dysphoria, and also attempts to safeguard those in the care of Catholic entities such as parishes and schools from contemporary gender ideology. But what exactly is gender dysphoria, and how do we respond to it best with truth but also with love? That's a question I put a few moments ago to our guest on this Diocese of Lansing podcast, the eminent reconstructive surgeon, Dr. Patrick Lappert.
Gender dysphoria is a relatively recent term. It is a term that has the flavor of diagnosis, but in reality is a term of compromise. The term that preceded it was body dysmorphic disorder, or gender identity disorder, more specifically, and it was deemed that gender identity disorder was too judgmental, and so the term of gender dysphoria was adopted. The idea behind the term gender dysphoria is that the problem is the feelings that the person experiences, rather than the actual condition of their sense of themselves. So when you say gender identity disorder, you're talking about a process of thought that's afflicting the person, that's causing them to suffer with the sense of themselves, and it calls the caregiver, the physician, the psychologist, the psychiatrist, it calls them to address a particular distortion in their sense of self. The compromise term, gender dysphoria, all that it addresses is the feelings of the person, and that the problem really is that they feel badly. And that leads to the position that the reason they feel badly is because of what you think of them. And so you've completely left the world of diagnosis and care and entered the world of political linguistics. So it has essentially dragged the topic out of the world of medical psychological care and into the political arena. That's what gender dysphoria, that's why those terms were chosen.
So do you think for the purpose of conversation, gender dysphoria is an appropriate or usable term, or we should use a different term?
I'm happy to use any term, provided that we're willing, using that as a starting point, to direct ourselves at what is actually afflicting the person who suffers with it, and that it doesn't prohibit us from looking at why they are feeling dysphoria or unhappiness. Is the happiness something that is the result of interior processes, or is the unhappiness the result of external forces? And we have to make that distinction, because on the one hand, you're in the world of power politics, and on the other hand, you're in the world of charity. And charity is what we're about.
As a condition, as a clinical condition, when was this first diagnosed or categorized in terms of a diagnosis? And traditionally, what has been the medical community's response to this condition?
Well, that's excellent. So as with many other conditions, the language of description that underlies it has changed over time. But it has long been known that there's an overarching category called body dysmorphic disorder. That is to say, a person's self-perception of their body as a mechanism for dealing with an interior wound or an interior anxiety. It's a very common thing in plastic surgery, and it's been understood for a long, long time, that there's a subcategory of patients who present themselves to plastic surgeons seeking a modification of their appearance. And it's not uncommon that people come to plastic surgeons with that request, but there's a subcategory of patients who will be asking you to change their appearance because they are looking for a fundamental and radical change in their life, a life that is characterized by sorrow and fear and a sense of isolation. And what they are doing is ascribing those terrible interior feelings, they're ascribing that to their appearance. One of the most common and readily accessible examples of that is the anorexic girl. She'll have an interior wound, an interior sorrow, that she ascribes to what she perceives as obesity. And she'll present to the doctor seeking help in losing weight. And when you look at the poor woman, she is skeletal. But because of this disordered thought process about her sense of self, she looks in the mirror and sees obese. And there's no amount of reasoning, there's no amount of data, there's no amount of explanation that can reason her out of it. Because underlying body dysmorphic disorder is a delusional thought process, right? The delusional thought process. And what is a delusion? A delusion is a fixed, firm belief that cannot be dissuaded with the facts, and it's impossible. That's what the definition of a delusion is. Well, it's impossible that a girl with a body mass index of 5% is obese. That's an actual medical impossibility. You can reason with her, but she holds that as a fixed, firm belief. She is obese. And so that meets all the characteristics of a delusion. And that's what underlies what in the broader category is an obsessive compulsive disorder. They have an obsessive thought, I'm obese. It leads to compulsive behavior. And it leads to the consequences of those things, which is social isolation, interior sorrow, and so on. In the case of the person with gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria, the obsessive thought is a means by which they can explain their interior sorrow. The obsessive thought is, I'm in the wrong body. My gendered self is in error. And that if I were to change that, I would be happy. So it's an explanation that people seek for an interior psychological problem. And it's a material explanation. That's the key to it, is that they're looking for a material explanation to a spiritual wound. And in this case, it just happens not to be their obesity, but their outward appearance of gender. So the broadest category is obsessive compulsive disorder. The subcategory is body dysmorphic disorder. And gender identity is when the body dysmorphic disorder, the content of that idea, has to do with the sexed self, male and female.
So how traditionally was body dysmorphic disorder, as it pertains to gender identity, how was that normally met or treated by the medical community, and when did that start to change?
Okay, so being a subcategory of obsessive compulsive disorder, the management scheme, sort of the state of the art as it stands, is the use, first of all, of a class of medications called serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The reason for using those medicines at all is that one of the goals of treatment is to turn down the volume with which that interior voice is presenting and representing the obsessive thought. So you're trying to turn down the intensity of that intrusive thought as a first step so that they can be reached with cognitive behavioral therapy. So what the goal of the cognitive behavioral therapy is to help the patient to understand the reality of who they are. In the case, for example, of the anorexic girl, the reality is that there is some level of interior wound or sorrow, oftentimes related to abandonment, and that also in that reality is that they are not obese, that they are in fact skeletal, right? And so one has to insist upon the truth if you're going to help them to cope with that. So then they learn to manage the obsessive thought. They learn to see it coming, if you will, and direct themselves in such a way that the conduct of any given day is more manageable for them, and they don't do the obsessive thing, rather the compulsive thing that the obsessive thought calls them to do. In the case of the anorexic, it's purging themselves of food. In the case of the transgender individual, it may be private cross-dressing to comfort their anxiety. It may be publicly presenting themselves as the other sex, but they're doing something, a compulsive behavior, to manage the obsessive thought, as if to prove the obsessive thought correct. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if traditionally the medical community would see this as a disorder, and a disorder that has to be met with care and intervention based on, you were saying, serotonin and cognitive behavioral therapy in order to try and realign that person back to the reality as was or is understood. Whereas, give us some idea as to the roots of the transgender movement, which would say, no, this is not a misalignment between your perception of reality and reality. Actually, the reality of this is you are the opposite sex and you have been born in the wrong body.
I have to confess that that's a very difficult jump to make, because what underlies it is a willingness to abandon scientific thought. So what we're really seeing here is not a change in the thought processes of the medical community. What we're seeing is the influence of political power on the conduct of medical care. Okay, and what lies behind the whole thing is the gender ideology, where gender became one of the central themes of quote unquote political liberation and self-actualization, and so it has been the case certainly since the 1920s and the dawn of the sexual revolution, that sexual expression was seen as the ultimate example of personal liberty, personal expression. And so lifestyle choices, as it's called now, is considered the ultimate expression of political liberty. And so as that grew, particularly in the feminist movement, the divorce between the sexual act and its consequences that has always been of a piece, the contraceptive separation of sexual activity and its natural consequences led to the idea that sexuality was really more about personal self-expression than it is about the union of a man and a woman in a permanent, life-giving union. And so that was sort of the starting point. But again, the political forces sort of took over feminism and brought it out of the academia and into the streets, and that has just continued. And so the devastating consequences that it's had on human identity is something worthy of further conversation if you decide to go in that direction.
So to be clear, the basic claim of the transgender movement is what? Is it essentially metaphysical? Is it to say that yes, we have a physical body, which is male or female, but then I have this external, I don't know if they'd use the word soul, but there's this external entity, if you like, which they would term gender identity, which can mean that I can have the body of a male, but this external metaphysical reality called gender identity, which can contradict the physical reality of my body. That's the basic claim, is it?
You've hit on the very kernel of the whole thing. So, and it's a startling thing, I should say, to hear physicians, board certified physicians in my own specialty, speak this way. They'll speak about a person aligning their bodies to be congruent with what they've always thought themselves to be. And there's a lot of rehearsed speech involved here. And the rehearsed speech is that precisely what you said. I am a man, but I was born in the wrong body. I appear to be a female, but I'm really a man born in the wrong body. Now I can speak from 40 years experience as a physician and surgeon. I've never attended a single lecture in my life, read a single academic paper, or heard any presentation or read a textbook that described the human person as a spirit being that may or may not be occupying the right body. It's just it's superstitious thinking. It's based on some sort of Gnosticism that there's a secret knowledge about who you are or who the human person is, that if you were only enlightened enough, you would understand, right? So, but that's it in a nutshell. It's a divorce not only of the meaning of human sexuality, but it's a complete abandonment of the Western understanding of what it is to be a human person. That dates back to before Aristotle, that the human person is a hylomorphic being, that there is a spirit and there is flesh, but the human person is those two things together, not spirit in flesh or flesh containing a spirit, but the two together make a single nature. So the singular nature of the human person that has the aspects of flesh and soul, you cannot divide those things and be speaking about a human person any longer. And yet, this is what science proposes now, that the human person is in fact a spiritual creature that can exist, that can be understood beyond the body, and that it may or may not occupy the right body.
So it's therefore, in terms of if somebody comes to you or another medical professional or counselor and claims to be transgender, is there any physiological or psychological test that can be undertaken to ascertain whether or not that claim is true, if we're dealing with something that essentially is, well, metaphysical, or as you say, suggesting that humans are spirit beings?
Well, let's take those in order. So if you want to look at psychological testing for transgenderism, certainly a simple questionnaire will bring out in a person these thoughts or these ideas. And so those sorts of tests are not of any diagnostic value, because the whole of transgender diagnosis is based upon a subjectivity of the person who presents themselves. So really the question we have to ask ourselves is there an objective test that would tell us that in fact this person who is presenting themselves as a woman is in fact a woman, but in the wrong body? So if you have a transgender person and another person, is there a difference in their chromosomes? Is there a difference in their genetic expressions? Is there a gene locus that produces certain products that would make them transgender? Is there a hormonal difference between transgender persons and other persons? Do they have influences hormonally that have affected their brain, and thus affected their sense of self? The answer to all those questions is no. There's no biochemical test, there's no genetic marker, there's nothing that I can do in that arena of chemical and biochemical testing that would confirm or refute the diagnosis. Are there functional differences in, for example, the functioning of the brain of a transgender person versus a non-transgender person? And very importantly, are there dynamic brain studies that can show us, well, here is a male brain, here's a female brain, and here is this third kind of humanity called transgender? The answer to that is no. All that those tests show us is that there's tremendous plasticity in the functioning of the human brain, influenced by experiences pleasurable or unpleasurable, that when represented will bring out that particular history. So for example, if you did a dynamic brain study on me when I was say a 10-year-old boy, and you were to waft a jigger of single malt Scotch whiskey under my nose, when I was 10 years of age, you would have seen a dynamic brain study that showed revulsion. And so you might have jumped to the conclusion, therefore, that I was genetically programmed at birth or before to be a teetotaler. If you did that same test on me now, that the smell of the peat in a single malt whiskey would recall memories of my life in the fighter squadron and drinking after flight operations, and it would be one of pleasure. And then you would look at that scan and say, an alcoholic. Neither one of those conclusions is justified. All that you're seeing is that through neuroplasticity, the responses of my brain has been changed over time due to my experiences. And certainly, if I had to pick the most powerful of experiences that a human person can have, they relate to their sexual experiences in particular, particularly experiences that happen in the first bloom of life, in the springtime of sexual maturation. Experiences that person is having at that time can have lifelong effects on pleasure responses or revulsion responses. And you cannot jump to any conclusions about, well, they were born that way. No, they were not. I wasn't born a Scotch drinker, but I sort of became one, right?
I was born a Scotch drinker, but that's a different
Well, there you are.
story. And I'm glad you've overcome your aversion to Scotch, if only for the good of the Scottish economy. So in terms of, we've been through a little bit of the history of this, and you're saying it's essentially a product of the sexual revolution and the sort of power play, power politics of that influencing the medical community to think in a particular direction. In terms of diagnosis, again, it would seem to be that there was prior to recent years, a low level diagnosis of this body dysmorphic disorder or gender dysphoria. But the evidence now seems to be that there's quite a significant spike in inverted commas diagnosis, or people presenting themselves with it, in particularly amongst adolescent females. What's going on there, Dr. Lappert?
Well,
what's going on there?
Right. So one of the important things to understand about this topic is that it's all over the internet, and so you can go to the internet websites and you can find everything from blog posts to live conversations that people are having. I think what underlies the whole thing is the sexualization of children at a very, very early age. As you may be aware, when we are young, particularly from the ages of about 3 to about 12, 13 when you're a girl, or 14, 15 when you're a boy, in that age range, you prefer the company of people who look like you. Your best and your closest friends, if you're a boy, is another boy. You have shared interests, you have shared humor, you have shared language. All of that is a shared thing. And it forms these bonds that are very hard to compare with anything else. It's where we as human persons develop the capacity for what is called chaste love. And it's not yet erotic love. That comes later, when adolescence sort of comes into its own, when that now the boy is more interested in those exotic creatures that he's been ignoring for all those years. And suddenly his heart turns in that direction of erotic love. Well, what's happening now is children in grade school and beyond, obviously, are being sexualized with questions like, I mean, there's actual literature that's given to school-age children, the most famous being the gender unicorn, where pre-adolescent children are being asked questions like, who are you sexually attracted to? What is your perceived gender? To ask a child who's 9 years old who they're sexually attracted to, or what is your sexual preference? Well, where are they going to find the answer to that? Certainly not in their personal experience. What they're doing is they're going online to find out what they are. And what you have is the unsupervised exploration of pornography by pre-adolescent children. So their minds are being sexualized. Well, a child who prefers the company of people who looks like them, who's hearing that the majority of people have sexual relations with people of the opposite sex, now starts searching for an explanation for why they feel the way they feel. So that's one issue.
Why would that spike, though, be amongst females? Why would you not see also a similar spike in young men presenting themselves as, in inverted commas, right, transgender?
It seems to be in the nature of the female brain that there's a time during which they can be very dramatically influenced, particularly by collections of or peer groups of young women. You see this all the time. I mean, the Salem witch trials are the great historical example of a group of adolescent girls, essentially talking back and forth amongst each other about experiences they may or may not have had, that led to accusations of witchcraft and all kinds of odd experiences that they were having, and people being essentially put to death over this group delusion that they've developed amongst themselves. And I'm not speaking as some kind of misogynist, but it's certainly a historic fact that the spikes of transgenderism that you see among like a collection of 8th grade girls, a school that had seen no transgender public conversation at all. Suddenly there's 4 or 5 girls in that school, all between the ages of about 13 and 15, who suddenly discover that they're transgender. It's seen on college campuses. The first paper to present that was published by a woman named Lisa Littman at Brown University about 3.5 years ago, because she did surveys of parents of self-identified transgender children and interviewed the children themselves. And what she discovered was that they were having online conversations, rehearsing the answers to questions that they would be asked by counselors, by psychiatrists, by their parents. And they were taught to say things like, I'm depressed, I feel like I'm going to take my own life. I've felt this way my whole life. Ever since I can remember, I thought of myself as a girl or a boy, and on it goes. And so Lisa Littman published this paper, and within a week, the publisher had to pull it offline because the hue and cry against that was so intense. Again, political forces influencing the world of medical care.
So in terms of how it plays out in real lives, the lives of real people, and in particular in this case, real children, once a child or an adolescent, influenced by whatever, says, I feel I'm transgender, what conveyor belt are they now getting put on in terms of counselling, chemical intervention, and possibly surgical intervention? Just spell out to us, for those who don't know,
okay,
what conveyor belt are they now on?
Okay, the most common points of entry are school nurses or school counselors or even school teachers, referring them up the line to nurses and counselors that may be out in the community with this quote unquote diagnosis. If that child is referred to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, the default position is affirmation of the transgender self-identification. In many jurisdictions, it's considered a crime, a hate crime, or a malpractice to suggest that child may have an underlying psychological problem that, if addressed, would help the child get over that sense of themselves. So anyway, the referral process then takes them to a gender clinic, where again, the default position is affirmation of the cross-sex self-identification. And then the question is asked, at what stage in their sexual development are they? If they're pre-adolescent, then at the very first sign of puberty, the child will be given puberty-blocking drugs. The justification for the use of puberty-blocking drugs is that if you can prevent the development of secondary sex characteristics, like the growth of breasts, or the facial hair, or the deepening voice, depending on which transgender, male to female or female to male. If you can block the manifestations of those secondary sex characteristics, then down the road, when the person is an adult, whatever surgical interventions may be called for will be technically easier, and the child will have adjusted to their cross-sex identification sooner. So that's the justification. As a sidebar here, there is no, first of all, there's no on-label usage of puberty-blocking drugs for transgenderism. Puberty-blocking drugs are for the treatment of precocious puberty. When used in the transgender child, it's off-label use. That's issue number one. Issue number two is even the safety, simply the safety of giving those drugs to a normal, healthy child has never been demonstrated. So what we're witnessing is a public experiment being conducted on the weakest members of our society. What is known about puberty blockade is that it completely blocks gonadal signaling to everything going on in that child's body. Everything from psychosexual development to skeletal growth, to coordination, decision-making capacities, everything, and just general growth of the child. So you stunt the growth of the child physically, you stunt the growth of the child mentally, and their bone density is way, way low. And what you have within a year is a child that actually physically looks different than their peers. So it is reinforcing the idea in the child that they're different. Meanwhile, what they're also getting in that transgender clinic, or that gender clinic, is tremendous affirmation. Now, a child that feels distress in their heart is going to feel uplifted by the affirmation of adults. So it will appear to be a good thing that you're doing for the child, to saying, oh, you're a hero, you're strong, you're beautiful, you're going to do really well, everything's great, come back and see us next month. affirmation. After a time, they'll reach the age when they need to start developing sexually, so they'll be given cross-sex hormones. So in order to have the effect of changing the appearance of a young man's body into the body of a young woman requires very high doses of estrogen. Likewise, to do the same for a young woman to make her look like a young man requires very high doses of testosterone, what we call supranormal doses of those medicines. And so those will have long-lasting effects, but they also have tremendous risk of everything from blood clots in the legs, emboli in the lungs, increased risk of cancer, all kinds of other things that attend those high levels of hormone. It's important to understand that all the while, you have this person who has an interior wound, an interior anxiety, and at every step you're offering them something new. And every time they start something new, they're given a hope that with this step, they're going to be able to overcome what's troubling them, their sexed appearance in this case, and that they will have a happy life. But inevitably what happens is they get to the next step. They've had the puberty blockade, but now they look different. So now they want to look like the other sex, so they start the cross-sex hormones. The cross-sex hormones will have a tremendously uplifting effect on their character. You know from the scandals of sports that high doses of androgen will make you feel like a king, right? You'll be out there thinking, oh, why didn't I always feel this good? If you give estrogen to an anxious young man, it's going to calm him down. Estrogen calms everybody down. And you'll think that you're giving them an actual definitive therapy, but you're not. You're just confusing the issue. So when the hormone therapy has the effects on the body, but yet the anxiety remains, then the gender clinic will say, well, maybe what we need to do is, modify the appearance of your face a little bit, maybe feminize your face, maybe we'll do breast implants. We'll take the next step. The next step is taken, the anxiety remains, time to take another step. And at every time you make another step, a hope is held out, and for a time it seems to be helping. Eventually you get to the definitive therapy, the castration, the creation of a counterfeit vagina, the removal of the uterus and the ovaries, the creation of a counterfeit phallus, all of those definitive surgeries that render the person sterile, and essentially making them a lifelong dependent of the medical system. And that will seem to help for a while. And yet you get through all of that, which may have spanned now, beginning, say, at age 7. Now you're out into the late 20s and 30s. You're talking about a considerable length of time. But if you look at the long-term data, and this is what most people do not do, you look at the long-term data, what you find is that the suicidality, the self-harm, the drug abuse, the incarceration for everything from prostitution to violent crime is at the elevated levels they would have been if you hadn't done anything at all, right? The problem you find in the medical literature is that they'll do an intervention like breast augmentation in self-identified transgender women. Does it improve, life satisfaction? Well, they'll take, 25 men, put breast implants in them, follow them for 5 years, and they'll go, never felt better, right? Because they're still in that flush of excitement of having taken the next step. The best source of data on this is actually the Swedish medical system, because they have a single database and everybody's in it. Everybody's in it, from before you're born until your body's room temperature. Every event of medical care, whether you're in a hospital, a prison dispensary, an outpatient clinic, or the school nurse's office, that data is going in there with the same language. And so you can look in that database and ask a question like, I have a 28-year-old self-identified transgender woman. What's the likelihood that she's going to be an alcoholic compared to age and sex matched controls? Now you can make some definitive statements because they're following people lifelong. What they find is if you follow transgender persons who've gone the whole gamut from, the earliest days right up through all of the cross-sex surgical procedures, if you follow them along for the first 6 to 8 years, it looks as though, my goodness, they have the same suicide rate as the general population. We have cured them. But then you get to about year 10, and year 11, and the curve just drops right off. And the long-term studies show that a person who has completed all of the transition steps has a 19 times higher rate of suicide, 19 times higher rate of suicide than persons who have not transitioned. Or I'm sorry, the general population. The general population compared to the transgender.
That's interesting, Dr. Lappert, because obviously one of the main thrusts amongst many from the transgender lobby is very often to play that mental health card, and sometimes a kind of suicide, almost a suicide card to say, if you do not indulge this young person, if you do not play along with or go along with or affirm this person in terms of this inverted commas transgenderism, they will kill themselves, and you will be to blame.
That's the cudgel that is commonly used, and that's also part of that rehearsed speech we were talking about. So it is a fact that transgender persons have a very high rate of suicide, higher than the general population by nearly an order of magnitude. In the literature, it's inflated, and people who know medical literature better than I do say it is inflated. But let's just grant them that transgender persons, and it is the case, that transgender persons have a very high suicidality rate. They have a very high rate of alcohol abuse. They have a very high rate of drug abuse. They have a very high rate of incarceration. They have a very high rate of being somewhere on the autism spectrum. They have a very high rate of being massively depressed people. All of that is true.
You're saying that's because we're bringing a surgical and chemical intervention to something that is essentially a mental health problem.
Correct. That is correct. That is correct. And it has to do with the person's sense of self, just like we talked about with the person who has body dysmorphic disorder. You can have a person, I've had patients come into my office seeking a change in the appearance of their nose because they thought if their nose looked different, they would be attractive to women, they would be married, they would be successful in business, everything would be right if you would just change the appearance of their nose. And you look at their nose and it's a completely normal nose. Why? Because they have a delusional perception about what's wrong with them. And they imagine that if they changed that, their life would be better. That's considered malpractice. In my training as a plastic surgeon, were I to offer surgery to that man who thinks his nose is the cause of all his sorrows, it would be considered malpractice. I'd be making money, and some in my career path might think, well, who cares? But the fact is, it just as if you don't do liposuction on an anorexic girl. It's the same thing. You don't feed a delusion. You don't feed a delusion. What you do, the only true charity, if you want to consider yourself a physician or surgeon, and you dedicated yourself to the well-being of your patients, it demands truth. Yeah. How could you possibly consider yourself a surgeon if you don't agree to the fact that there are certain truths about who the human person is, whether you're talking about what correct body temperature is, to what the right hormone levels are, to the fact that two legs should be roughly the same length. There are actual facts about human flourishing that cannot be denied. And to say that the sexed self is illusory, and that the human person is a spirit being that occupies a body, well, now you've completely left the reservation. Now you're
clear, in terms of truth, in terms of language, although the general term transition is bandied about, actually it's not a male body transitioning to be a female body. It's a male body transitioning to be a male body that has been surgically altered in order to give it a cosmetic appearance.
Correct.
Or to some extent of being female.
That is absolutely correct. It should be remembered. Part of the problem is that my specialty of plastic surgery is more than happy to give the public the illusion that we're like magicians, that we can turn, we can make silk purses all day long. And what is the case is that transgender surgery, the whole transgender process, is a sequence of procedures done on a patient that fundamentally mutilates their body in order to produce a counterfeit. Okay, what you're doing is you're producing a counterfeit vagina, for example, by mutilating the man's penis. Yeah. You're producing a counterfeit phallus by mutilating the woman's forearm. and in all cases, you're robbing them of a fundamental human faculty, which is their fertility, right? And you're forever separating their sexed self from its intrinsic meaning, which is the giving of life, right? So you render a person permanently sterile, and you've mutilated them, and you have not addressed the reason for their sorrow. So in the end, what you have is a sorrowful, suicidal, perhaps drug-addicted person whose genitals you've mutilated, and nothing more. And I cannot imagine anything more in the realm of malpractice than what I've just described to you.
If it is malpractice, and you're saying it is malpractice, to what extent, and I guess we're starting to see this in various places across the globe, to what extent do you think we will see a rise in young people, once they are into adulthood, turning round and not just pointing the finger, but pointing legal action at those who were responsible for, as you say, malpractice, or them not being counselled appropriately when they were young, whether those people are medics, counsellors, teachers, even parents? Do you think we'll see a rise in legal actions of this nature?
Well, I've been expecting that as the only real remedy for this problem for the longest time, and now we're finally starting to see it. And one of the first places has been at the Tavistock Institute in England, which is sort of the sole supplier of transgender services in that part of the UK. And the Tavistock Institute has been sort of at the vanguard of these interventions in young people now for many years. Well, they've had their first lawsuit, and as a result of that lawsuit, the British medical system has stepped back from its recommendations to, giving puberty blockade or cross-sex hormones to children, because what the case showed was, this is the case of a young girl who at 14 years of age was brought into that transgender service at Tavistock, and without question, without counseling, without anything, the default position was taken of cross-sex affirmation, and we started on cross-sex hormones, and was sort of sent into the pipeline for future surgery. Already the facial hair, already the lowered voice, none of which, well, the voice is irreversible. The facial hair can be attended to, but suffered greatly, and then realized that the problem was not that they were in the wrong body. Fortunately, this young lady woke up to the fact and brought suit against the British medical establishment and won the suit. And I think it's just the first of many that are coming down the line. How do I know this? Because I know that what they're practicing is not good medicine. And in time, the bad practice of medicine, the fruits of that become really obvious to people. Whether it's in the pharmaceutical industry or in the doctor's office or in the surgical suite, if you're practicing bad medicine, it's going to come to light and it's going to cost some money. So now, given that industry has so much money, they also have tremendous political leverage. And will they create for themselves some kind of safe haven? How could we have known? It was the best medicine we knew at the time. You can't hold us responsible. What I'm betting on is that competing lawyers, lawyers in competition, is what's going to win the day for us, because there's a tremendous amount of money at stake here. You're talking about medical systems. You're talking about hospital systems. You're talking about medical communities, the pharmaceutical industry, the surgical devices industries. All of them are very flush with money, and lawyers know this.
Whatever way lawyers win.
Right.
In terms of a Christian response and a Catholic response to this situation, and I know the Diocese of Lansing has recently or last week produced new guidelines for schools, parishes and others, which tries to a very two-footed approach, a very balanced approach, is the aspiration between truth and compassion. What is the Christian approach to this situation? Let's deal with, first of all, when when dealing with, in whatever setting, somebody who is confused about their gender identity or is actually diagnosed with gender dysphoria?
Well, the first and most important thing is to recognize that gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, transgenderism, whatever term is being bandied about, that is a reality. There really are people who have this sense of themselves, and they pay a very heavy price in their lives for it. You have to recognize that they're in grave danger from everything from substance abuse to physical sexual abuse by people they trust. There's a lot at stake. And so the very first thing to remember about a person who feels this way about themselves is that we have an obligation in love to serve them, right? To help them. Now, so there's the fundamental call to charity, right? Perfection in the love of God, because it manifests in the love of neighbor. First thing. The second thing is that charity, is being that it's perfection in the love of God, is also perfection in the recognition that there's a truth at stake here. There's a truth about the nature of the human person that is at stake here. And we as Catholics know that the truth is more than just a textbook full of fact statements or propositions about the nature of the human person. The truth is a person. The truth is the person of Jesus Christ. And so you cannot have charity if you are sustaining somebody in a lie. It's not, those two cannot be reconciled. So when you're in the service of truth, you're in the service of the good of the person, because the good of the person is what is at the heart of first of all, why the church is in the world and why Jesus came into the world. He came into the world, the physician of souls, right? And he came into the world not as a spirit creature who presented himself in the appearance of man, because if he had done that, then his work on the cross would not have been efficacious. It had to be a man dying on the cross, the God-man. And so if we imagine that humanity is a spirit creature that just occupies flesh, then that's how we have to understand who Jesus Christ is. And that is a false understanding of who Jesus Christ is. It's a Gnostic, it's Arianism. It's a heretical thing. And no one is served by heresy. Nobody is served by a portion of the truth, right? As St. John Henry Newman says, a portion of the truth is the most pernicious of lies, right? That to agree with somebody in a lie is not to serve them in charity. So we always have to remember that. So when people are insisting on things like pronouns or insisting on things like name changes, we have obligations in that. We have obligations not only in truth, but in love. And sometimes that can be a balancing act. It can be as mysterious a thing as trying to understand the perfect balance of justice and mercy, which we, of course, are incapable of, but God that's why he came to do that, right? Yeah, so we have to be just and we have to be merciful. And that can be a challenging thing. When you get down into the details, like a loved one insisting on a name change, that Joseph no longer wants to be called Joseph. Joseph wants to be called, Mary. Well, I don't have to call him Mary, but there's certainly a nickname that we may have shared in his childhood that he will accept because he hears the love in it, that doesn't force me to speak a falsehood, right? So there are some delicate and subtle things that we do. And we also have to insist that we are not to be the victims of a tyranny. If a loved one is starting to insist that you tell lies, you have to stop them and say, you cannot be tyrannical with me like that, and you cannot force me to do things against my conscience, right? Have mercy on me, right? Not just me have mercy on you. You have to have mercy on me. But first and foremost, we have to establish friendship. You have to establish friendship if you're ever going to have any hope of preaching the truth. So and so, for example, I have patients who come into my practice who are transgender, and I do things for them that are not mutilating, or that are not, maybe I'll laser off some facial hair on somebody or something like that. But I like that they come to see me because it's establishing a friendship. And every time they come in, I go in and I say hello. Maybe they're here for some skincare products because the androgens are causing acne, or maybe they're here for whatever reason. Establish a friendship, establish a relationship of love, establish a relationship that insists upon the truth. Because short of that, you're not going to serve anybody. You're not going to do anyone any good.
So, Dr. Lappert, that's a Christian approach to somebody who suffers with gender dysphoria. What about what is the Christian approach to trying to ensure that others, and particularly our young people, vulnerable, impressionable, are protected from, safeguarded from those who would proselytize this transgender gender ideology?
Well, certainly in this digital era, where everybody is convinced that their children are not safe if they don't have a phone with which you can contact them immediately, that's probably the greatest danger. The average age that a child gets exposed to pornography now is 9 years old. And that number has been falling steadily for the last several years. It's not uncommon. I know in our own parochial school at my parish that children who are in the 4th and 5th grade are asked to turn in their phones when they come to the school. Number one, because they're distracting, but the fact that they have them, right? Children do not have to go seeking pornography. Pornography finds them. And if pornography can find them, so can all of these voices that are trying to answer for them the sense of alienation that people are growing up in. In this era of the COVID, in this era of everybody wearing masks and all the rest of it, even before that, the sense of social isolation has been a growing thing. The breaking up of families, all kinds of things are contributing to it. And so children naturally seek the answers to these questions. Why do I feel badly? Why do I feel alone? Why do I feel different? Why does no one understand me? They look for those answers online, and there are predatory people online waiting to find them, waiting to offer them answers, whispering all kinds of lies into their ears. So if we're to have any hope of protecting a generation of children, you got to separate them from that. And if you're not, you're taking a tremendous risk. The other thing is, what is being taught in the school that I'm sending my child to? And people, very well-meaning people, they're being given this literature to present to their students that presents this idea that they have to define their sexuality at 7 years of age. Or they're presenting children with the idea that if they have a profound affection for somebody, the most profound expression of that affection is sexual in nature. They are sexualizing the normally chaste relationships of children. And that's having a tremendously devastating effect, because now the child withdraws into a private world of pornographic experience in which there is shame and more isolation, and the darkness just comes pouring on in.
Do you actually think it's in terms of a duty of care towards children, and in particular one's own children, that it's better at an earlier age to actually not even address these things as issues, so they're not even an abstract reality in their little lives?
I wholly agree. I think that's one of the great disservices that's been foisted upon parents everywhere, is this idea that, well, you better teach them early or somebody else will. And so this idea that of a very early exposure to sexual matters is somehow a benefit to the child is absolutely wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Because first of all, they don't have the capacities intellectually to even fathom the things that you're presenting to them, and particularly the matters of physical intimacy. That is not for children. The preservation of their innocence is part of giving them the capacity to develop socially. So, children learn the life of chaste love first in the family, and then in among their immediate friends. And we have to remember that chaste love in this life is an anticipation of eternity, right? That the life of eternity is the life of chaste love. And so that's why it's such an important developmental milestone in the life of a child. That's when they learn it. They learn to think outside themselves when they're about 2 or 3 years old. They learn to seek out friendship, and they learn this self-sacrificing love with their friends, chaste love. And so to rob them of that is to give them a tremendous impediment, a tremendous handicap in this capacity of chaste love. And this is what we see, for example, in the Courage Apostolate. The biggest hurdle that people have to overcome, for example, when they're struggling with same-sex attraction, is to understand, to recognize in their hearts that they are capable of chaste love with people of the same sex or otherwise. This is what everyone is called to, whether, and I hate to use the word heterosexual because it's a false identity, but men and women, regardless of who they're attracted to, regardless of what their vocation, whether married, single or ordained, or vowed in life, everybody is called to chastity, chaste love. And this is what children are being robbed of in public school, even in parochial schools. I found that literature, those books, in the parochial school library. We had a major purging of our library of materials like that had been benevolently donated, and the librarian didn't bother, and it got put on the shelf, and children were pulling that stuff down and reading it like, oh, gender unicorn. I wonder which one I am. Children should not be put in that situation.
For those who dissent from, like yourself, and like the Diocese of Lansing, for those who dissent from this emerging transgender, in inverted commas, orthodoxy, and you mentioned that this ideology has many influential, powerful friends in the academy, in the political world, in the media world. How dark and how threatening do you think things are going to get in the years to come?
Well, yeah, there is a gathering darkness, and certainly, recent political events here in the States have demonstrated to what degree those in political power see this as a central issue. If I could step back just a moment, I want to just ask, let's all recognize that what appears to be a medical problem, a psychological problem, surgical decision-making problem, is at its heart a spiritual attack on the human person. It's a spiritual attack on the human family. It's a spiritual attack, a diabolical attack on the image of God in the world. Humanity is the image of God in the world. God, the greatest revelation he has given to us is that God is one God, but in his essence, God is not alone. In his essence, God is a community of persons that is a life-giving community. And so to say that man is made in the image and likeness of God, the better representation of that is the human family, where you have a communion of persons in a life-giving relationship. And it is the family that is under attack with this the whole gendered ideology thing is an attack on the family. And why is it an attack on the family? Because it's an attack on the image and likeness of God that we are. And ultimately, the transgender delusion is an attack on our understanding of who Jesus Christ is, what it means to be incarnate, right? What it means to be incarnate. And so it's going to get a lot darker, trust me, because we've come to a time where they no longer bother wearing a mask in public. They're out there talking openly about these diabolical things as though as though they were talking about ordering tea. Now they're talking about the custody of children being taken away from their families because an 8-year-old child has self-identified as the other sex, and you're interfering with that. And the local children's hospital has now gone to the local court and is taking that child away from the family. I've had to give testimony in just such a case, and the family lost. The family lost. And it's just, we're just at the threshold of this. We are sort of ad limina on this demonic thing that's about to be unleashed. And but we're not foolish optimists. We are a people of hope, and hope is a theologic virtue, right? In the goodness of God, and what He has in store for us as His beloved children. So, yeah, it's going to get dark, but I don't care. And you know what? I'm not trying to be heroic here, but I fully expect, because I speak publicly about this stuff, that it's just a matter of time, before I'm in the hurdle on my way to Tyburn. Okay, if any of that makes sense.
Well, I was thinking during this interview we can use this as part of the canonization process, just after the martyrdom. And if there's a martyrdom, I think you only need one miracle, don't you? Or you're already there.
I think you're already there.
You see,
Thank you for your confidence, sir.
No
that I will have
problem.
that I will persevere in my hour of darkness. That's really what we should be praying for, though.
Yeah.
We need to pray for a spirit of perseverance, that it isn't some bullheaded insistence on the truth, but it's perseverance in the love of God when the light is going dim, when we are no longer able to work because the darkness is upon us, that we will all persevere in our love of God, our love of the truth, our love of neighbor. And that's really all we have to do.
Well, on that point, let's conclude on that point, Dr. Lappert, because I know you're Dr. Lappert, and obviously we've now designated you a future blessed or saint, Patrick Lappert. Saint, scholar and martyr, but you're also a deacon or an ordained deacon as well. So if I can ask you just to lead us or to conclude us in prayer, and also to impart your blessing upon those who are listening or watching.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty and ever-living God, you have given us the light with which to see the truth, and have given to us a heart that seeks your face. We ask that you bless all those listening to us today. Bless them with a tenderness of heart to see the suffering around them, and to offer the hope that is your Son, Jesus Christ. We ask all this in his holy name. Amen. And may Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.